Why is it that men will sail the seven seas, climb the highest mountains, look into the vast expanse of the universe and try to unravel those mysteries, and yet, in the end, they're strangers to their own heart? For me, this journey has not really been about the ark. It's been about really finding something more important in life and more lasting. What I've tried to do in the last year is actually take more of an inward journey and ask myself, what is it that we're really searching for? There's men that have come up here, their marriages are broken, they have broken relationships, broken families. They're good men, in many cases godly men, but life in some cases has been hard. I really bonded with these men. I think they have hearts of gold. I've traveled the world, been to 60 countries, 6 continents. I've climbed 5 of the 7 summits. I've skied to the North Pole. I've journeyed to the ends of the earth. But I did not have the courage until the past year to make an 18-inch journey from your head to your heart.
So we hope for good weather.
I feel like I'm a better person, better father, better man because of the Ark expedition. We're looking for some type of redemption, some type of transcendent moment where we step out of the grind of life and we find something mystical, magical, something spiritual that just elevates our souls. I sought the Ark, but instead I found the face of God. Good morning, Kansas City and Abundant Life Church. Good to be here. I'm from the great state of Michigan, and I already want to let you know I forgive you for last night with the Kansas City Royals. So I'm putting myself in a position of humility. I was hoping to come out and rub it in, but it didn't quite work out that way. So somebody was praying last night, and obviously more people in Kansas City were praying than in Detroit. Good to be here. I want to thank Rod Hanley. Rod, are you somewhere here? Rod Hanley is with Character That Counts Ministries, and Rod is my host for the week, and he's got me speaking just about everywhere, and his lovely wife, Jana, who ironed my shirt and gave me a great breakfast this morning. I think I want to stay in Kansas City. This is a great place. Nobody did that for me on top of the mountain, you know. People are like, why did you wear a hat everywhere? I mean, we're in this film, and it's like, well, if you don't, take a shower for 3 or 4 weeks, you better, more clothes is better. So I'm just really excited about being here. Thank you, Pastor Phil, for allowing me this opportunity to share. So you saw in the video here, it's really a juxtaposition of 2 different narratives that are happening, and I think it in many ways illustrates what life is like on a real level. We have an obvious narrative of our life that is explicit. It's what we do. We wake up every day. We're a father, we're a mother, we're a son, a daughter. We go to work. We have an occupation. We have career goals. We go to church. We're involved in the community. All of these things are great and wonderful, and that's the obvious narrative of our life that we find ourselves walking into. And it's a script that plays out, and we do it until the end of our days, and then hopefully nice people have nice things to say about us when that story is done, and the preacher doesn't have to lie. And so it's this part of life that's like, yeah, you know what, I know I'm supposed to be doing these things. And it's very obvious, and it's very explicit, and so when you watch the film, you'll see that here's a bunch of guys, a bunch of yahoos like myself. There's only one professional actor, and he actually doesn't act in the film. He's just the narrator. Gary Sinise, Lieutenant Dan, is actually our narrator, and so everyone else is just these average guys that somehow got involved in this crazy story of looking for Noah's Ark, which I have to educate my children's teacher every year because they're like, man, your kids are really smart. I have a 10 and a 12-year-old, and they're really great kids, and they actually are mentoring some other students in the class, but they have a very active imagination. They're telling us that you looked for Noah's Ark, and you ski to the North Pole, and you do all these crazy things, and so I have to tell them, no, it's really true. It's actually that. So at least my kids know what I do for a living, because a lot of us get dressed up when we go to a building somewhere. My kids know, okay, Dad is a little different, and he does things a little bit differently, but it's kind of cool, and so they're part of that story. So these are things that are obvious. They come to the surface, and we're looking for Noah's Ark, and we've spent 5 summers looking for this thing, some of which is actually over a 6-year course, and that story is still not done. And so we're looking for this ark, and we're trying to find this ship buried in ice, because if we find this ship, it's more than just a piece of wood. It's probably the greatest archaeological discovery that any one of us could make. Greater than the Ark of the Covenant, because we know that God makes his habitation inside of us today, and Jesus Christ comes into our hearts, and we have a relationship with him. But if you find this ship, like the gentleman said in the trailer, it changes everything. It changes all theologies. So you can start with anthropology and archaeology and go all the way down the timeline to zoology, and it changes all of these things, because now all of a sudden you have to rewrite all these different textbooks, and you have this most fantastical story in the Bible that usually gets relegated to, either an animal shelter or the children's nursery theme, and nobody really, that's kind of a crazy story. But if this story is true, if there is a ship on top of a mountain at 17,000 feet that has no business being there, then perhaps all the other stories are true as well, because it is certainly one of the most fantastical or fantastic stories that are involved in the biblical narrative. And so we understand what's at stake here. And so we're willing to risk life and limb. I'm an explorer. I'm an entrepreneur by background. I was a minister as well for a season of my life. But most of the guys that are there are really, really smart people. They have patents to their name. They're Indiana Jones type. They can read the Rosetta Stone. They speak dead languages, but they can't tie their shoes. So I'm the guy that's there. I mean, I literally dress 2 or 3 of them every day. Like, it's almost like, I was Mama Santa Claus or something. They come out and they're like, okay, do this. What do I do here? And Brother Kevin, all that stuff. So I was really this average guy that had some experience climbing high altitude mountains, 5 of the 7 summits, and I also had a trip to the North Pole. So I was used to extreme environments, and I knew that none of these guys knew what they were getting into. When you climb at 17,000 feet, just to kind of get a picture here, if I were to take out 60% of the oxygen in this room, most of you would be comatose in a matter of minutes. Your brain would swell up, your lungs would fill up with fluid, you would have both cerebral edema and pulmonary edema. So when you're doing work, and it's almost at the elevation of Everest Base Camp, which is about 17,500 feet, we're approaching 17,000 feet, and this is our workplace. This is where we get up every day, and we're trying to do something that's Herculean. We're trying to dig a hole into the ice. And this isn't Kansas City ice, it's not Grand Rapids, Michigan ice. This is glaciated ice. It's like concrete, so we've got running chainsaws, we have a pulley system, we've got fumes, we've got guys fainting with running chainsaws in their hands. Top that off with a geopolitical situation that is far from ideal. So we always have a military detail that comes with us every summer, because we're in a part of the world where there's 2 different groups. It's kind of like a Hatfield and McCoy thing, and they both are on the mountain, and they don't like each other, and they just spend a lot of energy killing each other. The PKK, which is a U.S. State Department-recognized terrorist group, is our porters by day, and perhaps they have another occupation by night. And then we have a Turkish tank battalion that's at the foot of Mount Ararat that's using that as target practice along with the PKK. So you have a lot of people there that don't like each other. Sounds like an average day at work, right? And then on top of that, you've got all this storm activity. It's so electrified, and so the static is in the air to such an extent that many occasions, and I've never had this on other mountains in the world, in the Rockies you might experience some of this as well, but it literally felt like you just stuck your head into a beehive, because your hair is standing straight up, you can hear it crackling, and you're looking around you, and what do? You have a lot of aluminum around you, right? So you got ice axes, and you have crampons, and you've got poles for your tents. So there's a lot of different things that are happening here at once. You've got 60% less oxygen. You're trying to excavate a hole to figure out what this anomaly is that you're trying to track through remote sensory intel and your ground-penetrating radar and your seismic and electrical resistivity tests that are all saying there's something underneath the ice. We just don't know what it is. And we won't know what it is until we get boots on the ground and we actually do core samples and drill into this ice. So every year, it's like, wow, we're trying to find this thing, and we felt like the technology was getting better and better, and our intel was getting better and better, and we thought, man, this is going to be the year. We're going to find Noah's Ark this year, and it's going to change the world. They're going to have to rewrite all the history books. It's going to be the holy grail of archaeology. And so every year, I began to get more and more invested in this process. Some of you, anybody a deer hunter here? So you know what it's like to get buck fever. I mean, if you're into baseball, whatever it is. So my thing was the Ark. It just began to overtake me. It almost became like an obsession to the point where you have no objectivity left. And so the obvious narrative was, yes, we need to find the Ark. And if we find the Ark, something great will happen. And we can somehow maybe bring something redemptive to the world that could actually bring people into the kingdom. The harder part is to look at the narrative and find out what is less obvious, what is oblique, and what is implicit. So your life has really two narratives. You have one that's obvious, it's what you do every day, it's the labels that you wear, or the mask, if you will, or the occupation that you have. It's what you do in life, it's how people identify you or how you identify yourself. But there's this other narrative that runs underneath that narrative. It's subterranean, it's almost subconscious, and it's deeper, and it's more profound, and it has a whole lot more to do with your calling and the reason why you were born. So a lot of times we get this mixed up. We think what we do is kind of like why we're supposed to be here, and that could be partially true, but there's something larger than that. So when you read verses like Proverbs chapter 25, verse 2, it talks about how the glory of God is the secret. The glory of kings or queens, or all of us are royals, if you will, because we all came out of the garden and we all were royal regents, and we were these incredible individuals who were imitating the image of Christ, and there was no disconnect between us and our Father, and so we could walk with him in the garden, and we could be naked in every way, shape, and form, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, because it wasn't so much about not having clothes on, it was about being true. Everything that we did before the fall was true. There was nothing to hide from. There was no shame. There was no regret. There was no pain. There was no shadow. There was no sin. And so all of us are trying to get back to this place where the glory of kings is the search. The glory of a queen, the glory of the royals, if you will, not to be connected necessarily with Kansas City, but it's what makes us who we really are. And so I found that about the third year going through this whole explorative journey, that there was something in this story that God was trying to speak to me that he had to use very obvious images to impact me with, because I'm a real image guy. I've got ADD, ADHD, and you can tell I'm kind of going a million miles an hour. I can work with this. When I go down south, they're like, man, you got to quit talking so fast. I mean, we don't do things quick. We always talk about we're fixing to do things, and then we do it. And so it's just pop, 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 pop. So sorry about that. It's this Robin Williams approach. I have a lot of things that go on all at once. Thank you for humoring me. So we get to this point where we've just got to settle into this story, and I'm thinking, there's something deeper that's going on here, and I can't quite put my finger on it, but I have a feeling, I've got this sneaking suspicion that God is making a secret out of this ark, and he is using that search to bring about who I really am, or in my case, who I once was. And he's using this ark as leverage to bring me to this point where he's making it so obvious that I can't actually miss it. And so when you find this story called Finding Noah, a lot of people are like, well, why do you call that movie Finding Noah? Are you actually looking for a body? And if you find him, is that like the secret to everything? No, I think with the filmmakers, and they don't spell this out, I think they leave a lot of room for personal interpretation, but I think what the filmmakers are trying to say is that when you find Noah, you find yourself. Because we're all Noah. We feel like, quite frankly, the center is collapsing. You don't have to look hardly at all in the news. Turn it on for 5 minutes, and it just feels like the world is just erupting in chaos. All the tension that's felt between the races and religion and different ethnic backgrounds and socioeconomic perspectives, it just feels like there's this incredible ball of chaos. And it's like the poets were talking about, how the center is collapsing and how the falcon is just circling and circling, and we're watching this thing unravel like a thread. And Noah, I think, probably felt like that because it's down to really 8 people. And everybody else around him is just shouting blasphemies. I mean, this guy had like 100-year-odd preaching assignment, and he doesn't have any converts. Every day he's waking up and he's doing this project and he's working with his family, and he probably had some hired workers, and every day he's saying the same exact thing. This is coming, judgment's coming. And so a lot of scientists believe that the imagination of the people couldn't even quantify or couldn't even calibrate the idea of rain, because perhaps before the flood there was the canopy in effect, and so mankind could live to almost a millennia. And reptiles could grow into dinosaur proportions. And so for them to even conceive of a flood, of rain coming, of springs opening up, it was probably so foreign to their imagination they couldn't even conceptualize it. But this whole idea of righteousness was foreign to them as well. And so here you have Noah in Genesis chapter 6, verse 8, who found something that everybody else was looking for, but he's the only one that found it. And I guess you could argue that it found him. Genesis chapter 6, verse 8, depending on what translation you have, I like the King James Version. It talks specifically about how Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, or favor in the eyes of the Lord. Now, here's what I can say about grace, and there's a lot more I can say. I've written stuff on it, and so if you're into blogs and that type of thing, I have a table in the back. You can sign up for that. I've got business cards if you want to friend me on Facebook. There's a lot of content that's out there if you want to really dig into this whole message. But suffice for this morning there is a part of God that is only attracted to your imperfections. So I worked a lot with Muslim Kurdish individuals as we were on Mount Ararat in Turkey. We're about 10 clicks away from Iran, so we're in kind of a very interesting part of the world. A lot of Persians are on the mountain at the same time of us, or Iranians, whichever label you prefer. But these Kurdish gentlemen had a very definitive construct for justice. In fact, the whole world does. It's called karma. You reap what you sow. You do bad, you're going to reap bad. You do good, hopefully you reap good. But sometimes that gets all mixed up, and you get these Job-like characters that are doing all this really good stuff, and still bad stuff happens. And so we have this sense of betrayal, like, man, there's got to be something more to life than that, because sometimes bad things happen to good people. And so we sense this level of deep betrayal, like, where is God on that day when that situation happened? And we walk away from it either getting our answers, or if we're fortunate enough, and if we're persevering enough, God gives us the gift of himself. And I find a lot of times with tragedy, and I'll talk about mine here in just a moment, very briefly, when tragedy hits, when trauma hits, when the day of the dragon comes, when the darkness comes and the shadows come, whatever that situation is, you know what I'm talking about. You can just basically put in words and names and places into those margins. We have two opportunities. We can either come to God and say, I deserve answers, and we can posture ourselves like Job and say, you know what? I don't understand what's going on, but I demand that you, the Almighty, answer my questions. The problem is they're bad questions. And the problem is, if God answers those questions, you will explode into infiniteness. You can't handle, it's almost like a Jack Nicholson thing. You can't handle the truth. You will explode. You don't have the bandwidth. And so God has to take Job into this situation, into an audience of one, where all the counselors and friends and all the chaos and his own pain is quiet, and his wife, everything. It's just him and God. And he has this epiphany where he begins to realize that it's quite simple. God is God and he's not. And more than that, God gives Job the gift of himself. And instead of answering Job's bad questions or his unanswerable questions, God gives Job his unquestionable self. And that is a beautiful thing, and I'm telling you that is probably one of the hardest things to get to, because we all want answers. But essentially when we're doing that, we're trying to tell God how to do his job. And we're angry and we're hurt. Job did everything right, but he did everything based out of fear. He was always afraid. So he made offerings for his kids that partied too much the night before. He was the most righteous man. He gave, he was generous, and God blessed him. But then piece by piece, his world fell completely apart to the extent where he lost everything, and he's just sitting on a pile of ashes, and he's just scraping away his sores, and he's ashamed, and nobody wants to talk to him anymore. And his name and his integrity has been tarnished, and everybody's trying to point out what devotional he missed, or what secret spiritual formula he missed, or what service he missed, or if he didn't read his Bible enough, or if he didn't do enough good things. And so they're nitpicking at all these things, and then God shows up and says, look, guys, first of all, tell your friends to be quiet because they don't know what they're talking about. There is another narrative that's going on in this man's life that we don't. Now, as readers, we have this privilege, but Job did not have this privilege. So when the book of Job was written, we see that there's this whole other sub-narrative that's going on. And we don't have privy to it, and we can't access it. But what's happening is that God and Satan, the origins of light and darkness, are basically basing their reputation on a single man. And the devil comes in, as you know the tale tells. He comes in and says, look, this guy is a great man, and you've blessed him. And it's easy to say good things about God when things are going well, but just take away some of that stuff. Take it away, and we'll see what comes out of this man's mouth. And so over the course of time, all of his stuff is taken away, and he's left with nothing, and God says, you can take everything, but not his life. Now, notice very carefully and clearly, the origin of evil is not emanating from God. But because he is so powerful and he's so sovereign, even evil is one of his servants. So be careful what you call evil, because I think what we call evil, sometimes God just says, no, that's just one of my servants. So we have all these bad kings that are running around in the Old Testament narrative that were bad and did bad things, and God calls them my servant Cyrus, my servant Darius, my servant Nebuchadnezzar. And so I think evil is really this dog, this mangy dog, that's on a leash, and the leash is grace, and God uses evil to accomplish a greater good. Now, if I was God, I don't know if I would do it that way, because it can sabotage people and it can leave them spiritually bankrupt, but we have to trust in God's integrity and in the bigger picture that he knows what he's doing. And so Job gets to this point where he's like, wow, I need an audience of one, and then God fills him with himself, and then his life doesn't really matter a whole lot anymore. Why? Because God showed up. It's amazing how all of your questions go away when God shows up. When he fills you with his presence, and all the stuff in your past becomes less and less and less. It's almost like taking a step into the other dimension, into heaven, and you can begin to realize that all the things that you were so consumed with on earth mean nothing in the larger view. In fact, that stigma and that pain and that grief, it can't even attach itself to you when you enter into heaven, because it can't belong there. There's no real estate for that type of human suffering. And so I think what God was trying to do with Job is just bring him to that place where he just gave him a slice of heaven, just a little piece, and then we know that his story turned around. So we're all Noah. We're all trying to find this sense of grace. We're all trying to find this safe place. We're all trying to find this ship that we can enter into. Now, I want to posit to you this morning that Noah was saved long before he built a ship. In fact, in Genesis 6:8 again, it talks about the favor. It talks about God's grace that came into his life. And so in some way, shape, or form, Noah was able to grasp a hold of this mystery, or this mystery found him while the world was drowning in madness. And I find that as I speak everywhere, mostly in men's conferences, that there's this sense of desperation. It's quiet, it's desperate, like Thoreau talked about, and it's this idea that why am I here, and what am I supposed to be doing, and what is my actual calling? What is the thing that really puts fire in my bones, and why do I feel so emotionally stuck and so emotionally vacant that I don't really feel passion for anything except for maybe the Royals? I mean, I get excited about that, but I come to church and it's just, it's like this whole visage comes on, and it's just, the Super Bowl mania takes over, but we don't have that with our relationship with God. We have it in sports, but we don't have it in our connection with him. And this is the God of the universe that we're talking about. And so I've been able to discover through a very painful and humbling process. Now, the enemy is great about humiliation. God is about humility. There's a very distinct differentiation between those two. So if you feel humiliated this morning, or if you feel shamed, I can tell you that that origin is not found in God. But if you find that God is bringing you to a place of humility and healing and redemption, that's where it's coming from him. It's emanating from his character. It's emanating from who he is. So my message really is about finding Noah, because we're all about Noah. We're all Noah. But it's also about finding grace. And grace is, if you can look at it this way, grace is a girlfriend or a wife or a significant other that is only attracted to your imperfections. So all of my Muslim brothers, again, they have a very defined construct for justice. And they live in fear all the time, because they don't want to do bad things, because then bad things will happen. So there's no real warm fuzzies between them and Allah. A lot of fear, a lot of angst, anger, violence, all this stuff kind of comes bubbling out because it's not a real healthy connection. It's not out of love, it's out of fear. And then you have a bunch of other religions that even might have a construct for mercy, where you don't get what you deserve, you're actually being withheld. The bad thing is being withheld from you. But then you have this wonderful thing called grace. And I loved it when C.S. Lewis was with a bunch of scholars one day. They just said, what is really the difference between Christianity and all the other world religions? And he said, it's simple. It's grace. This is our exclusive domain that I believe is kryptonite and is a paradox that our enemy will never, ever understand, because he can't give it, because he's never received it. But grace is essentially not just a withholding of judgment, but it's getting something back really good that you don't deserve. So I go to a therapist, you can tell. And I believe everybody should go to therapy, because I think that's the muddy stream that sometimes we have to go through to become humble and to allow people to speak into our life and to touch our owies, if you will. Justice is, when I visit my therapist, he should charge me for that visit, right? That's justice. There's an exchange. It's his time. It's valuable. This is his profession. Mercy would be, okay, Kev, I want you to come and visit me, but I'm not going to charge you. Which he didn't for the last many visits. He feels like it's an extension of his ministry. But grace And I'm not going to give you his phone number, but grace is where the guy pays you to see him. Now, either I'm like really, really screwed up, right? Or, wow, this guy is so messed up, I got to pay him to show up. Or God is trying to make something so obvious to me that this is what grace is. This is what grace does. It doesn't just deny the bill, but it pays the bill. It pays the sacrifice. It's what the cross is all about. It's why the enemy is so confused about the cross as the epicenter, because everything before and after the cross and during the cross, it all comes back to this moment of grace. In fact, I think you could argue that the king is now on his throne, who is Christ Jesus, and he's praying for us. Every time I feel down, I remind myself, the Son of God is praying for me right now. He's praying for all of us. He's got the bandwidth. He's got the technology where he can send individual text messages to 7 billion people if they have the right smartphone, right? And so he's able to connect with us as human beings, but it's this part of him that's able to not only pray, but now all of a sudden we're moving into this area of grace. And she's kind of like this steward of the kingdom. And all of a sudden, we have a whole new dimension that is accessible to God because Christ paid the ultimate sacrifice. We don't have to do animals anymore. We don't have to go through all these rituals. We basically just have to believe that Christ paid the bill. That's the gospel, guys, right? I mean, it's right there front and center in front of us. And so now we're talking about Noah, and then we're talking about grace. Let me talk to you about finding home. And this is what really hits home for me, and this is where I have to be incredibly vulnerable and incredibly honest with you, because I'm not a guy that has a Disney-esque ending. I'd encourage you to come watch the film tonight, because you'll find that some of the greatest discoveries we make in life are what we find while we're searching for something else. Part of my story involves trauma, and I wouldn't have been able to identify that or associate with that unless it was for the whole movie Finding Noah. Let me explain. So every year, we have a military detachment that's with us, whether it's a Black Ops Vietnam individual, and you'll see him in the video tonight, Cowboy, good friend of mine, or we might have a Navy SEAL with us or an Army Ranger. Every year it was different, but we had a military detachment with us for security reasons. And these guys were getting into my story. And I thought, you know what, this whole PTSD thing, it only is for combat people and, you know, for guys that have had to really just go through it. And as I began telling them my story, they're like, dude, you got what we got. In fact, you look just like us. We're looking into your eyes, and you've got that 2,000-yard stare, and you're not home. We don't know where you are, but you're not home. In fact, you remind us of ourselves. We came off the battlefield, and the battlefield followed us, and we tried to get back into our homes, and we try to reconnect with our wives or our girlfriends or our children, our parents, and we are unable to. And it kills us on the inside because we know that we're not able to connect on a deep level with other humans because we feel like there are parts of ourselves that are frozen. And so it's a very desperate place to be when you want to reach out, but you can't because you feel, quite frankly, like you're a leper. You know, the greatest gift that Christ gave to lepers was the ability to feel. Can you imagine being a leper in the first century and having to be isolated into a colony somewhere where you can't even have normal relations with your family, with your friends, so all you are surrounded with is people whose body parts are falling off and they can't do anything about it? In fact, you could wake up one day and, oh, there's my thumb. Man, I wish I had felt that. Gosh, I would have felt really good to have at least felt that. You know, I miss my thumb. Or, man, there's my hand. How did that fall off? It's almost like the opening scene in Saving Private Ryan where they're on D-Day, you know, and the guy keeps trying to attach his arm. It's not on his body anymore, and it's not going to be back on his body, but he keeps searching around. And he's looking for that arm. Where'd that thing go? And he sticks it back on, and then he marches up the beach. And I find that trauma is like that. Let me give you a couple of images here to connect the dots. Trauma, if you've watched the Chronicles of Narnia, was written by C.S. Lewis, one of my favorite authors, who also was a highly traumatized individual. Essentially grew up as an orphan, so his characters are all orphans. Went to World War I, which was probably the most hideous experiment against humanity ever devised by man. All of this technology, all these mechanized ways to murder mass amounts of human bodies all at once came into that war. From chemical warfare to flamethrowers to planes and tanks and machine guns. And so now we have a way to kill a lot of people really quick. So he's highly traumatized. He comes out of World War I. He was in an artillery unit. He takes some shrapnel. He gets back home. He starts writing, but the guy next to him in the same artillery unit is blown up into a red mist. He's not there anymore. There was a body there, but nobody's there. So he's got all this trauma. Now, I don't know if he intended to do this, but I want to just put some God goggles on you for a moment. Go ahead and watch and read the Chronicles of Narnia. To me, the White Witch of Narnia is trauma. And she comes into your life, and everything she touches is freeze-framed. So the day that you were raped as a child, the day that you were abused by your babysitter or by the Cub Scout leader or by the priest, or the day on the battlefield when something horrific happened, or the day you went bankrupt, or the day you were told that this person no longer loves you and wants to divorce you, or the day that you had to bury your child, these days are frozen in time. And you can't access that moment because you're frozen. Now, you continue to live because you have to live. You get up every morning, you do the same thing, and you have a ritual, but there's a part of you that is dead. And it's inaccessible, and you can't feel. If you're taking notes this morning, if you want to take home a nugget, you can't heal unless you can feel. If you can't feel, you're not going to heal. Right? So what do we do with all of our lives? We medicate, we numb. I used ministry for years as a form of medication because I was so miserable. I was so full of self-hatred that the only way I could get out of that was to get really busy with other people. And so ministry became my favorite drug, and unfortunately, a lot of people applaud that because they don't realize what you're doing at the same time. They think it's just this noble thing, and it's like, no, really what's happening here is I don't like being around me. I'd rather be around a whole bunch of people. I'd rather speak in front of thousands of people and tell them my worst day than have to sit alone in silence and be with myself. I don't like being with me. And that's what trauma does. And so these guys were like, look, you got what we've got, and there's a way out. And that's where I began to bump into grace, because if time makes a wound, time itself cannot heal that wound. It is a lie that time heals all wounds. It doesn't. It really doesn't. It may cause your memory to get a little foggy, and it becomes less severe, but time has no power to heal a wound that occurs in time. So what has to happen? Without getting too crazy metaphysical here, you've got to have another source outside of time come into time and heal that wound once and for all. And I think that that thing is grace. And I think that grace is God's biggest and best and brightest and boldest idea because it has the power to change the world. I want to go to my counselor every week because he's paying me to see him. Something changes out of my heart. I'm like, this is crazy. How does this work? And so I feel a connection with this guy, and we're journeying together now, and it's more than just a client-professional relationship. It's transcended that. That's what grace does. It's God coming into your mix. It's God coming into your life, and it's like water. It goes down to the lowest point, and it meets you right where you're at, and it touches those leprous parts of yourselves. So what do I do for a living now? I basically am Bilbo Baggins, very tall. I got my handkerchief here. And I basically help a bunch of dwarves find home. But to get home, we've got to tackle this dragon. Smaug is inside the Lonely Mountain, which is emblematic of our heart. We're looking for the Arkenstone, which is emblematic of the human heart. I am climbing a mountain, which is called Agri Dağ, which is the painful mountain in the Turkish language. I'm climbing this mountain every year, and I didn't realize that at the end of the whole story, what I'm really looking for is not the Ark. I am looking for my heart. I am looking for the part of me that existed before the dragon came, that existed before the day of darkness came, that existed before I went through 2 divorces, that existed before I went through bankruptcy, that existed before I spent 3 years living in my truck once I climbed out this mountain because I couldn't find my home address. I'd rather live in a vehicle than have to come home to an empty place, because at least in the vehicle I think, wow, it's just another phase of the expedition. And this whole thing will figure itself out. But what I'm really dealing with is, no, I'm just scared to death of being alone inside a room, because it just reminds me of my life. Vacant, empty, void of any human connection. Here's what I can tell you. When Christ comes into your life, he touches the deepest and darkest wound that you are hiding so desperately from him, and he touches that place. And when he touches that place, he lets you know that you are a human being that is worth being saved. Can you imagine being a leper and everybody's running the opposite way, and it's almost like you're you're a pedophile in a sense where you've got this electronic collar around you, and everywhere you go, you have to shout, unclean, unclean. Stay away, keep the kids away, keep everybody away. I can't be around play. All this stuff, and you walk around and you've got this sense of incredible shame, and you're trying to connect, and then Christ comes into that situation and does the exact opposite. He doesn't just wave a holy handkerchief or become the televangelist and tell you to buy a product and something good will happen. He comes in and he touches your leprosy, and he kisses where that leprosy is. Almost like what the Pope did a year or two ago with that man that was incredibly deformed and kissed that man on his wound. That's what the cross does. That's what grace does. It touches those desperate places. So how do you exit out of trauma? How do you find home? You first have to feel, but you first have to realize that you are not a criminal. You're a climber. If you climb Everest, they'll take you all the way up to 25,000 feet, which is the death zone. Your body has no ability at that point to acclimate any further. So everything you do from that point and upward, which is another 4,000 feet, almost another mile, your body is dying. Your brain cells are dying. Your body is deteriorating. You're a fish out of water. So what they'll do is they'll push you all the way up, a month and a half of preparation, acclimating, climbing, back and forth, put you up at 25,000 feet, and then they'll do something that seems so counterintuitive. They'll tell you to go all the way back down to 12,000 feet. Why? Because nothing heals in thin air. Your wounds can't heal in thin air. You can't get your appetite in thin air. You can't think clearly in thin air. So you go all the way back down. You get your appetite, all your cuts are healed, all your respiratory issues, and for 4 or 5 days, you're just a glutton. It's like this visual orgy. Everything's green again. There's trees, there's valleys, there's running water, and then in 2 weeks, you shoot from that point all the way up to the top. Can I tell you something this morning, just to take a moment of shame off of you, and then we're done, can I ask you, can I plead with you to recognize that you are not a criminal, you're a climber, and the reason why you may be so low right now or feel so low is that God has something so high for you to climb. He's got to take you so low so that he can heal some of these issues that never otherwise would be touched. And that, my friends, is the story of my life. My life looks like a heart algorithm. It's whop, 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 and a lot of us just want this. And when you look at all the biblical narratives and all the stories that are involved in the Bible that mean something, that actually had an impact, you'll find that these were individuals who understood that they're not criminals, they're climbers. You're not a prisoner, you're a patient. And can I plead with you this morning is allow God to touch those wounds in your life, and don't misinterpret the hurt as punishment or punitive. He's just a really good surgeon, and he's cutting open a wound that's infected with lies and shame and trauma, and he's trying to make you well. Thank you so much for being here this morning.